we'll get started on my fun presentation on PowerShell. It'll take 20 to 30 minutes. We'll start off my presentation as I start all my presentations with a mouse click and an intended audience statement. So the intended audience of this presentation is going to be students that want to end up in IT security. So enterprise IT security, very broadly speaking, that looks like good number of users, probably a Windows environment, nice Microsoft shop, etc. And I deliberately contrast this with people who want to try to end up in maybe security research or software development, because those sorts of people would probably be better focused on learning a more pure programming language. This is PowerShell, which is debatably not even a scripting language, but it is very cool. So we're going to get some really fun applications. I hope that everyone likes them. We're even going to show some red team usage of PowerShell. And talking about the perspective that I bring to this and why I think PowerShell is valid to learn and valuable is I've worked in Fortune 500 IT and security as an intern for the last 5 years. So I work on computers and get important people coffee. And I found PowerShell probably to be the most valuable asset I have in my tool bag. So next slide, using arrow keys. We'll talk first about what is Microsoft PowerShell. And I say Microsoft PowerShell instead of Windows PowerShell because a number of years ago, Microsoft PowerShell stopped being a Windows-only product. Some people who may or may not sometimes deal with Windows subsystem for Linux may find it fun to maybe play around with PowerShell on Linux and see what kinds of things you can get up to. There's lots of modules on there. But it was first introduced in 2006, and it kind of became quickly popular as a replacement for Visual Basic Script, which if you've ever done anything related to anything remotely related to Visual Basic, you're probably happy that people don't have to endure that anymore. And a definition, a very specific definition of what Microsoft PowerShell is a cross-platform, object-oriented command line shell where you run command line utilities. I grabbed that definition straight from a book, and that book did not call PowerShell a scripting language. And the reason it did not call PowerShell a scripting language is because it is a darn shell language. And in fact, as my bottom bullet notes, it is the replacement for command prompt. So that leads us into the discussion of why you should learn PowerShell, or why should you care about PowerShell. First bullet being command prompt, cmd.exe, long-term, that's going to be deprecated, or at least Microsoft wants it to be. They don't want command prompt on future installations of Windows. I don't know how many centuries in the future it'll be before they get there, but they've already replaced about 95% of traditional command line cmd.exe utilities with a PowerShell function equivalent. So if you want to get your head in the game, you gotta get in the PowerShell game. And I provide an example of one sort of utility that's replaced, a traditional command prompt utility that's replaced, that's certutil, but a more fun one is netstat. We all know netstat because we're security people, or at least most of us who have been exposed to it. That shows all the active network sessions on a computer. There's a PowerShell equivalent. There's actually 2 PowerShell equivalents. They're less pretty, but they actually include a lot more detail and a lot more properties. And if you know a bit about scripting, you can have quite a lot of fun with them. The second reason you should care about PowerShell is because don't trust me, trust people that I claim that I talk to. When I first started as an IT intern, I really wanted to be a security intern. I wasn't one yet, but I waddled around all the security people at my company on a fun tour. And I waddled up to all of them and I asked, if you could learn one thing, or if you could know one thing right now, or if you'd recommend I do anything, what would it be? And they all resoundingly said, I wish I knew Windows PowerShell. My life would be great if I knew PowerShell. My wife would love me again if I got if I understood PowerShell. Everyone loved PowerShell, and everyone wished that they had a better comprehension of it because of how useful it is in a Microsoft Active Directory Windows network. Third bullet, PowerShell is not that hard. I'd say it's less intuitive and readable than something like Python, but PowerShell was the first language I ever learned. And that was when I was like 17 or something. I don't know. I was still eating my boogers. So let's go into some applications of how we can use PowerShell. PowerShell is very useful in IT, and this is why everybody recommends you get to know it. It's amazing for Active Directory administration. If you take a class like IA 244, I think is Windows administration, and IA 462, I'm currently taking with Krieger, which is very cool. There's lots of opportunities. You may not be told about these opportunities, but to make your life much easier by using PowerShell. So normally when you create a user in Active Directory, you got to right click the thing, click new user, type their first name, type their last name, click an OK box, wait for a screen to load, wait for some lag. It's a big nightmare. PowerShell has all these command line utilities, and you can make scripts that make it super duper easy. You can even import 1,000 users in through a CSV file, for example. So Active Directory administration is super easy, and querying Active Directory is awesome. I like making group policy objects because I hate group policy. I think it is the most ugly Windows application known to man. I hate looking at it. I hate thinking about it. So I like to use PowerShell instead. Your end system service system management, PowerShell is pretty good for. You can start your processes, get your services, relay all your information, put it in a log file, create a new scheduled task, query all your scheduled tasks, find out which permissions on your system are insecure, all these fun things. And then I list general automation. Sending emails is a very common application. You make a script that says, when thing happens, PowerShell script, send email. It's very fun. You can also query the web using invoke web requests. You can make API queries. Those are also fun. Yeah, lots of very good. Oh, wait, what's that evil cloud on the right? That evil cloud has an Azure logo. If you're going to be doing stuff in Azure, like making virtual machines or whatnot, you're probably at least for 10 seconds going to get exposed to the Azure command shell or the Azure PowerShell module command line interface. And those 10 seconds may be very scary, but you can actually do a butt ton of stuff in Azure using PowerShell. It's very cool. But we are security people. We hate IT. They're the enemy. They always want to push through stupid projects or something, make dumb firewall rules. Anyway, this just means that we need to think about PowerShell from a defensive perspective. What usage does PowerShell have for defense? So I touched on this a little bit earlier, but a lot of traditional command line utilities like netstat, et cetera, they're kind of deprecated and their outputs are kind of stinky. They're just text. You can't really do much with that. But you can use PowerShell scripts to better gather information in live forensic response, which the word forensic there is maybe questionable, but you can gather information very, very quickly and output it to a file very, very easily. Shutting down attackers is something that you can do with PowerShell. So maybe you make a script that's disable AD user based on properties. You click a button and it stops the bad guy from using that compromised account. You don't have to log on to the domain controller and open up a nasty GUI that makes you want to vomit, that lags, and the system doesn't have enough RAM, so it stalls, etc. You can also use PowerShell to do packet captures, which is really interesting. Normally you think, well, if I'm going to do packet captures, I need Wireshark or TCP dump. You can get packet captures using PowerShell. It'll be in a different format than like a PCAP file, but you can sniff network traffic using PowerShell, and that's really useful, sometimes for evil purposes. And then in kind of the same way that Bash has the Bash history file, there's also a PowerShell history file, so you can see what commands have been executed in PowerShell. You can see what evil people are committing. So this leads into PowerShell for Evil. And that is a PowerShell Palantir, which I'm very proud of. It took 14 seconds to make that. But the biggest use case for PowerShell in the land of evil is living off the land. A lot of modern day adversaries don't want to be installing a bunch of malware and stuff on systems, because when you install brand new software on something like a domain controller, if the good guy's security is set up right, there should be about 3 million alarms going off when that happens. PowerShell is built in to every Windows system. So if you can do something in PowerShell, you don't need to install malware. And there's tons and tons and tons of evil modules you can find online related to PowerShell for evil. PowerSploit is a pretty common one that I see in CTF exercises and things of that nature. You can do fun things like Kerber roasting, which is my favorite word. You can enumerate all the users and everything in the world. You can get file listings and see nasty permissions that you don't like, etc. Empire is a PowerShell module framework that was designed to kind of demonstrate the malware capabilities of PowerShell. The project has since ended, but you can still go download those files. Bloodhound uses sharphound.ps1, a fun script that you run on a Windows system to gather information that you feed into Bloodhound. Bloodhound, if you don't know, is a cool graphical utility that kind of maps out a network and all the assets that are on it. It's very cool for reconnaissance when you're doing kind of like a CTF exercise. Excuse me. And you may think, well, all these modules are great, but I still got to download them. Nope. Some of them, it's a little bit necessary, but oftentimes you can actually just go straight into the PowerShell module, copy and paste a function, and just plop it into your PowerShell terminal. And now you have this evil function that's 10,000 lines long that is very evil and very powerful. So,
Isaac,
hi.
I'm digging the Lord of the Rings thing. Oh,
Yeah.
now we have Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, so this is a fun slide. I stole this slide from ShowMeCon 2018, but this is what a piece of malware looks like written in PowerShell. It is horrible. I hate it. People in person can't see Keanu's caption, but it says, "What is that?" This is what a legitimate piece of PowerShell malware looks like, and it's extremely obfuscated. They're using things like base 64 encoding. They're using lots of redundancies that don't do anything. They're capitalizing and uncapitalizing every other letter to make it just god awful to read. It's very fun. And this shows, yeah, evil PowerShell malware exists and it's in use. Now, a slightly simpler, depending on your familiarity with scripting and coding and stuff, I wrote this. This is a PowerShell reverse shell. And when I wrote this, I had to tell Windows Defender to stop deleting it about 20 times because it really hated this thing I made. Right? It's a reverse shell, so it connects to a listener on an evil PC, and it just relays all of the commands that are executed between the two systems. So it's very fun. It's currently configured to connect to localhost, so it wouldn't do anything, but this is how you'd get like a remote code execution kind of thing going on. What is my next slide? This is some fun projects I've done with PowerShell. And that icon on the right there, that figure, is Microsoft's official PowerShell hero character. Pretty cool looking. Yeah, they have like a long, elaborate comic you can look into where they're like defending cyberspace and fun stuff.
What's it called?
I want to say this is PowerShell Hero or something. I don't actually know the character's name, but they're very fun.
We all know it's actually just Cyberpunk Edge Runners. And yeah, it is PowerShell Hero.
Cool. So I'll talk a little bit about some projects I've done with PowerShell because I've done some fun things and I want to convince you that PowerShell is cool and can do cool things. One thing that I did for my current team is we had a bunch of things that had information, but we didn't know how to get that information in a centralized place. So what I did was I made a PowerShell script that made a log file of everything. And it was a CSV file, so it had date, property 1, property 2, property 3, everything all together in one log file. I configured log rotation in the exact same script so that every time it ran, it automatically rotated the logs. And I set it up as a Windows scheduled task that ran every day or every 5 minutes or whatever it was. And I had logging every 5 minutes, and we ingested that into our SIM, Security Information Event Manager. So Splunk, Azure Sentinel, QRadar, things of that nature. It's fun. That's where you put all your stuff. I've done a lot of fun API work with PowerShell. I was initially very scared of the word API, of the acronym API, Application Programming Interface, because I can't really make a program. I've never made an app, and I don't know what an interface has to do with this, but it turns out those are pretty simple to use using a fun tool that I discovered on the next slide. You can query APIs. The first one I did was a vulnerability management system. It had information as to everything that was connected to it and at all of its patch levels. Now, it was really cool, but it had a horrible user interface and it wouldn't tell you things very easily. You had to log onto the thing and see, oh, there's 28,000 systems out of date today. Fun, woohoo. So I made an API that relayed all that information into a single place that we could easily ingest later. I did the same thing with a firewall API. So after when a company gets old, maybe 20 years old, maybe 40 years old, maybe 100 years old, maybe it's had IT for a very long time. It has a lot of old legacy connections. It has a lot of old legacy firewall rules. And when you've got like 20,000 firewall rules in your firewall, you don't know what is allowed and what is not. So what I did was I made this API query that helped us figure out what's going on. And that allowed us to figure out, oh, hey, this rule is pretty permissive. Let's close that down. This rule has not been used in 7 years. In fact, every IP address it's associated with has been retired for 7 years. Let's delete that rule, that kind of thing. And then a fun one that I mentioned earlier is you get on a file system and you find files with overly permissive access control lists, so things that you have write permission that you should not have write permission to. So this can be fun in a CTF scenario. I did a CTF once where there was a scheduled task running and you didn't have permissions to edit the scheduled task. But if you looked, the scheduled task ran a PowerShell script and you had write permissions to the PowerShell script. So you could just modify the PowerShell script and set up your own backdoor that automatically runs every 5 minutes or however long it was. It was very fun and very silly and kind of real. This is that tool I was talking about with regards to APIs on the last page. APIs are horrifying, in my view. You got to mess with HTTP headers and everything. I don't like it. But there's a cool tool called Postman. And what you can do is you can go online, you can look up Postman first API query or something like this. And you can just figure out how to make a very basic API query and query something fun. So the source I have in this picture is the Internet Storm Center from the SANS Institute. And I'm just querying their most recent attacks. I provide my user agent string, which is they require it to be your email address, and it outputs some IPs and attack information. Okay, that's pretty cool. Where's PowerShell come into this? You can click a button that I put a red arrow on right here. And then when you click that, it allows you to select a scripting or other language in that you want to make that API query through. So this is my make code button. I didn't have to write anything. It was great. So APIs are pretty fun. But all this is kind of complicated if you're not really familiar with it. And I'll say most of my use case that I get out of PowerShell is not really that complicated. It was my first coding language ever, I know. So that means I was still wearing diapers and had a binky in my mouth, and I was still able to figure out a non-zero amount of stuff. And you don't need to do any darn scripting or very minimal scripting to make your life a lot better in an IT environment. So I include some commands at the bottom. These are commands I use every single day because they're just the best way of getting information for querying Active Directory. I find a computer, I get a ticket related to a computer. Maybe it's not, maybe its antivirus is out of date or something. I'm like, well, what is this thing? I can look in IT's out of date asset management system, or I could just query Active Directory directly. Oh, it's a Windows system. It's Windows 7. That's horrible. And it was created 13 years ago. That sucks. That kind of thing. DNS hostname, what's it resolved to? One of the ones I use, which makes me slightly creepy, is get AD user for Active Directory. And I use this when someone messages me out of the blue and they're like, hello, what do I do with this? And I don't know who this person is. I don't know what department they're in. I look at the org chart. I don't know anyone related to them. I don't know what's going on with this person. I'll get the AD user, I'll find out the information. I usually like to look at the creation date. Oh, this guy was hired 3 weeks ago. He has no idea what's going on. I'll just send him to the help desk. And then I give them the help desk number. It's helpful and fun. It makes my life easier. Bottom one is just how to get all the text files at a directory. It's pretty cool. So here are some learning resources for those who are interested in PowerShell. The first book, the first extracurricular learning activity I ever engaged in probably was Learn PowerShell, Windows PowerShell in a Month of Lunches. That title is already inaccurate because it's Microsoft PowerShell now, and it's SQL. The idea behind that book is you have like 30 lessons, 30 chapters or something, and they're supposed to take about an hour and a half. It took me a little bit longer because I'm slow, but I eventually figured it out. That's how I learned a lot of my initial PowerShell. Some websites that exist, adamtheautomator.com, Adam Bertram. He's this hyper genius when it comes to automation of things for IT. He's pretty cool. I love all his stuff. Microsoft has an Introduction to PowerShell module that you can look up, just like Microsoft Introduction to PowerShell training. And I think it'll come up. I think it's completely free. I think it had like 5,000 reviews and they're all like 4.8 stars. And it's just like a video kind of course. Good learning resource. And if you want to learn PowerShell for red team contexts, I list 2 try-hack me's that I'm aware of. The first one is Hacking with PowerShell, which is a very good introduction to PowerShell in a red team context kind of way. That stuff is like very simple use of PowerShell. And that second one is Post-Exploitation Basics, which is a bit more complicated, but you get to play with PowerSploit. And if I remember correctly, you do some Kerber roasting of that, which is really cool. And is that all my slides? Yeah. That concludes this presentation. So if anyone has any thoughts, questions, confessions, etc., I will take them now.
Oh, I have one.
Yeah.
So you mentioned invoke web request and invoke REST method. What would you say are the differences between those two? Because in a language like Python, you just have like one HTTP library.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a bit?
So I can't give an amazing explanation, but from my understanding, invoke web request is very akin to something like curl, which is like a really, really simple grab website kind of way of grabbing things. Invoke REST method. Let's go back a few slides actually and see our Postman slide. Let's see if I can find it. On our Postman slide, I use invoke REST method. So I think if you're dealing with APIs, you're probably going to be doing more stuff with the invoke REST method command. I think that's pretty cool.